March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany. The ancient cathedral loomed over streets choked with rubble, one of the few structures still standing after 262 Allied bombing raids had reduced the city to ruins. Corporal Clarence Smoyer peered through the periscope sight of his tank, his hands steady on the gun controls despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He was 21 years old, a coal country boy from Pennsylvania, and he was about to fire at a German Panther tank from less than 100 yards away. The Panther's gun barrel pointed directly at him, muzzle to muzzle. At this range, whoever fired first would win. Whoever hesitated would die. Smoyer didn't hesitate. His fingers squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun roared, the massive recoil rocking the 46-ton tank backward. Through the smoke and dust, Smoyer saw his armor-piercing round strike the Panther's side, punching through steel that was supposed to be impenetrable. He didn't wait to assess damage. AP, he shouted to his loader, calling for another armor-piercing round. The second shot followed seconds later, then a third. The Panther erupted in flames, black smoke pouring from its hatches as the crew scrambled to escape. The entire engagement lasted 45 seconds. It was captured on film by Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, a combat cameraman who had positioned himself to record what everyone expected to be a Sherman tank engaging the Panther. What he filmed instead would become one of the most famous tank duels of World War II, a David and Goliath story with a twist. The American tank wasn't a Sherman. It was something the Germans had never seen before, a secret weapon that had arrived in Europe just weeks earlier. The German Panther commander never fired his gun. His crew would later explain why. They thought the American tank was one of their own. They had never encountered anything like it. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The secret tank had already destroyed them. This is the story of the M26 Pershing, America's answer to German armor superiority, a tank so new and so classified that even the enemy didn't recognize it. It's the story of how 20 experimental tanks changed the balance of armored warfare in the final months of World War II. And it's the story of 5 young American tankers who took one of these secret weapons into combat and proved that American industry and American courage could match the best the Germans had to offer. But to understand how revolutionary the Pershing was, we need to understand the desperate situation that made its deployment necessary. We need to understand why, by late 1944, American tankers were going into battle in vehicles they knew were outmatched, outgunned, and inadequate against the steel monsters Germany was fielding. The M4 Sherman medium tank had been America's workhorse since 1942. By any objective measure, it was a good tank. Reliable, easy to maintain, produced in vast numbers, and adequate for the missions it was designed to perform. The Sherman could be manufactured quickly using automotive industry techniques. Its components were standardized and interchangeable. Its gasoline engine was reliable, and parts were readily available. Crews loved its spacious interior, its reliability, and the fact that it rarely broke down. Against German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs in North Africa and Italy, the Sherman had performed well. The 75mm gun mounted on most Shermans could penetrate these earlier German tanks at reasonable combat ranges. The armor, while not exceptional, provided adequate protection against the weapons these German tanks mounted. American tankers had confidence in their vehicles and their tactics. But by 1944, the Germans had introduced new tanks that fundamentally changed the equation. The Panther medium tank and the Tiger heavy tank mounted guns and armor that made the Sherman obsolete overnight. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. A Sherman struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor even at point-blank range. The mathematics of tank combat had shifted decisively in Germany's favor, and American tankers were paying the price in blood. The problem wasn't that American engineers couldn't design better tanks. The problem was doctrine and institutional resistance. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who headed Army ground forces, believed that tanks should focus on infantry support and exploitation, not tank versus tank combat. Under McNair's doctrine, enemy tanks were to be dealt with by the tank destroyer force, specialized vehicles mounting powerful guns on lightly armored chassis. McNair insisted that heavily armored tanks were unnecessary because tank destroyers would handle enemy armor. This doctrine might have made sense on paper, but it fell apart in combat. Tank destroyers, with their open-top turrets and thin armor, were vulnerable to artillery, infantry weapons, and return fire from the tanks they were supposed to destroy. More importantly, battles didn't follow neat doctrinal boundaries. Sherman tanks frequently encountered enemy tanks in situations where tank destroyers weren't available. When that happened, Sherman crews had to fight with inadequate weapons against superior opponents. The 75mm gun on standard Shermans fired a 17-pound projectile at 2,600 feet per second. This was adequate against earlier German tanks, but struggled against the sloped frontal armor of Panthers and the heavy armor of Tigers. American tankers learned through bitter experience that frontal shots against these German tanks were often useless. They had to maneuver for side or rear shots, exposing themselves to German fire in the process. Many Sherman crews died trying to get close enough for a killing shot. The Army did develop an upgraded Sherman mounting a 76mm gun with better armor penetration. But even this improved weapon struggled against German heavy tanks at typical combat ranges. The fundamental problem remained. German tanks could kill Shermans from distances where Shermans couldn't effectively return fire. This disparity in capability meant that American tactics had to compensate for inferior equipment. Sherman crews learned to use superior numbers, better coordination, and aggressive tactics to overcome German armor advantages. But using 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther meant losing 3 or 4 Shermans in the process. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. American tankers joked grimly that it took 5 Shermans to kill a Tiger, for to distract it while the 5th got a side shot. The joke had a bitter edge because it was based on reality. Tank battalions took staggering casualties. Experienced crews were killed and replaced by green crews who often didn't survive their first engagement. The crisis came to a head during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler's last major offensive in the West threw concentrated German armor against American lines in the Ardennes forest. The attacking force included roughly 400 Panther tanks, Tiger IIs, and other German armored vehicles. American forces, including many Sherman-equipped tank battalions, took heavy losses. The inadequacy of American armor could no longer be denied or excused. Eisenhower himself requested that only 76mm armed Shermans be sent to Europe for the remainder of the war. But even this wasn't enough. What the Army needed was a tank that could fight German heavy armor on equal terms. They needed a tank with a more powerful gun, heavier armor, and the weight and power to compete with Panthers and Tigers. They needed, in short, exactly the kind of heavy tank that McNair's doctrine said they didn't need. Fortunately, American designers had been working on such a tank since 1942, despite official indifference and active resistance from Army ground forces. The development program that would eventually produce the M26 Pershing had begun as the T-20 medium tank series, an attempt to improve on the Sherman's basic design while incorporating lessons learned from combat. The T-20 program represented a fundamental rethinking of American tank design. Instead of incremental improvements to the Sherman, engineers started with a clean sheet and asked what an ideal medium tank should look like. They wanted better armor, a more powerful gun, improved mobility, and enhanced crew protection. Most importantly, they wanted to reduce the tank's profile to make it a smaller target. The key innovation was in hull design. Major Gladion Barnes and Colonel James Colby, who led the design effort, realized that by reducing the internal volume of the hull, they could add more armor while maintaining comparable weight to the Sherman. They designed a lower, more compact hull that sat closer to the ground. This made the tank harder to hit and allowed thicker armor without excessive weight penalty. The new design featured torsion bar suspension instead of the Sherman's vertical volute spring suspension. Torsion bars provided better ride quality, more reliable performance, and allowed the hull to sit lower. The transmission was moved from the front of the hull to the rear, eliminating the vulnerable drive shaft that ran through the Sherman's fighting compartment. This rearrangement improved crew safety and freed up internal space. For armament, the designers selected a 90mm gun, a dramatic increase over the Sherman's 75. The M3 90mm gun was based on anti-aircraft artillery and fired a 24-pound armor-piercing projectile at 2,750 feet per second. This gave it significantly better armor penetration than anything previously mounted on American tanks. At typical combat ranges, the 90mm could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther and had a reasonable chance against a Tiger. The armor protection was substantially improved over the Sherman. The T-20 featured up to 4 inches of frontal hull armor and 3.9 inches of turret armor, compared to the Sherman's 2.4 inches and 3 inches respectively. More importantly, the armor was better sloped and arranged, providing improved protection for equivalent weight. The design included a 3/8-inch steel plate behind the driver and a 1/2-inch bulletproof glass windscreen for the driver and bow gunner. As the design evolved through variants designated T-20, T-22, T-23, T-25, and finally T-26, the engineers refined and improved the concept. Each iteration incorporated feedback from testing and combat reports. The T-26, which would become the M26 Pershing, represented the culmination of this development. It married the 90mm gun to a hull with excellent armor protection, torsion bar suspension for good mobility, and a well-designed interior that provided good crew working conditions. The final design weighed 46 tons, making it considerably heavier than the Sherman's 33 tons, but lighter than the German Panther's 45 tons or the Tiger's 57. The Ford GAF V8 engine produced 500 horsepower, giving the Pershing adequate, if not spectacular, mobility. Top speed was 30 miles per hour on roads, with cross-country performance somewhat less impressive due to the relatively low power-to-weight ratio. This brings us to the Pershing's main weakness: it was underpowered. The same engine that gave the 33-ton Sherman good performance struggled with the Pershing's 46-ton weight. Acceleration was sluggish. Hill climbing was difficult. In muddy or rough terrain, the Pershing could bog down where a Sherman might have kept moving. Crews who transitioned from Shermans to Pershings noticed the reduction in mobility immediately, but the trade-off was worth it. The Pershing could survive hits that would destroy a Sherman. The 90mm gun could kill German heavy tanks that Shermans couldn't touch. For crews who had watched friends die and Shermans destroyed by Panthers and Tigers, the Pershing's protection and firepower were worth the mobility penalty. Better to move slowly and survive than to move quickly and die. Production of the T-26E3, as the Pershing was designated before being standardized as the M26, began in November 1944. But getting the tank into production was only half the battle. The bigger challenge was overcoming institutional resistance to deploying it. Army ground forces, still committed to McNair's doctrine despite mounting evidence that it was flawed, dragged their feet on ordering the tank into production and shipping it overseas. The catalyst was the Battle of the Bulge. When German armor broke through American lines in the Ardennes, the limitations of American tanks became impossible to ignore. Senior commanders, seeing the casualties inflicted by German Panthers and Tigers, demanded better equipment. On December 22, 1944, orders were issued to rush Pershing tanks to Europe for combat evaluation. But by this point, the war had less than 5 months remaining. There simply wasn't time to produce Pershings in large numbers, ship them to Europe, and distribute them to combat units. The initial deployment would be limited to 20 tanks, divided between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. These would serve as combat trials, testing the Pershing under battlefield conditions while providing at least some improved capability to frontline units. The 20 Pershings arrived in Antwerp, Belgium in January 1945. They were distributed to select tank companies in the 32nd and 33rd Armored Regiments of the 3rd Armored Division and to units in the 9th Armored Division. The tanks were given to the best crews, experienced tankers who had proven themselves in combat and could be trusted with the experimental vehicles. The deployment was conducted with considerable secrecy. The Army didn't want the Germans to know about the new tank until it appeared in combat. Intelligence officers worried that if the Germans learned about the Pershing's capabilities, they might develop countermeasures or adjust their tactics. So the Pershing's arrival was kept as quiet as possible. Crews were briefed on the new tank, but instructed not to discuss it. The tanks were camouflaged and kept undercover when not in use. This secrecy would have an unexpected benefit during the Battle of Cologne. German tankers, having never encountered a Pershing, would have no idea what they were facing. The unfamiliar silhouette would cause confusion at exactly the wrong moment, with fatal consequences for at least one Panther crew. Clarence Smoyer had joined the Army in 1943, drafted at age 19 from the coal country of Pennsylvania. He was a quiet young man, soft-spoken and unassuming, but he had a natural talent that the Army recognized immediately. He could shoot. Whether it was rifles on the range or tank guns in training, Smoyer had an instinctive feel for ballistics, windage, and leading moving targets. When he was assigned to armored forces, it was natural that he became a gunner. Smoyer was assigned to Company E, 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, the famous Spearhead Division. He arrived in Europe in June 1944, just after D-Day, and saw his first combat during the breakout from Normandy. By the fall of 1944, Smoyer was an experienced combat veteran, having fought through France and into Germany. He had seen friends die, watched Shermans burn, and learned the hard lessons that kept tank crews alive. His tank commander was Staff Sergeant Robert Early from Fountain, Minnesota. Early was everything a good tank commander should be: calm under fire, tactically smart, and willing to take calculated risks. He had proven his leadership during months of combat, and his crew trusted him completely. When the word came down that Company E would receive some of the new Pershing tanks, Early's crew was selected to receive one. The crew consisted of 5 men. Besides Smoyer as gunner and Early as commander, there was Private John DeRiggy from Scranton, Pennsylvania as loader, responsible for handling the heavy 90mm rounds and ramming them into the gun's breech. Technical Corporal William McVeigh, the driver, controlled the 30-plus tons of steel with practiced skill, maneuvering through rubble-choked streets and across shell-torn terrain. Private Homer Davis served as bow gunner, operating the hull-mounted 30-caliber machine gun and serving as an extra set of eyes for the crew. These 5 men had been fighting together since September 1944. They had learned each other's habits, developed an almost telepathic understanding of what each man would do in combat, and built the trust that came from shared danger. When they transitioned from their Sherman to the new Pershing, they brought this experience and cohesion with them. They named their new tank Eagle 7. The name came from the designation E7 painted on the fenders, identifying it as Vehicle 7 from Company E. But the crew liked to think it referred to the Philadelphia Eagles, the football team that represented their home region. The name was painted on the turret, and Eagle 7 became their identity, their home, and the weapon they would take into the final battles of the war. Training on the Pershing took some adjustment. The tank was bigger, heavier, and handled differently than the Sherman they were used to. The 90mm gun had more recoil and required different fire control techniques. The visibility from the turret was slightly different. The crew had to learn new procedures for loading ammunition, operating the radios, and coordinating their actions. But they adapted quickly, and within days, Eagle 7 felt as familiar as their old Sherman had been. The first thing crews noticed about the Pershing was the sense of protection it provided. The thicker armor, the improved shot traps, the better arrangement of internal components. All of it added up to a tank that felt substantially safer than a Sherman. Tankers who had watched German shells punch through Sherman armor like tissue paper appreciated the Pershing's ability to withstand hits. The psychological impact was significant. Crews felt less vulnerable, more confident, more willing to take the fight to the enemy. The 90mm gun was a revelation. For the first time, American tankers had a weapon that could reliably destroy German heavy tanks at combat ranges. The gun's report was louder, the recoil more violent, but the results were devastating. Armor-piercing rounds punched through steel that had previously been impervious. Tankers who had spent months trying to get close enough to Panthers for killing shots now had a gun that could engage them at 1,000 yards or more. But the Pershing was not without problems. The engine, adequate for the Sherman's lighter weight, struggled with the Pershing's bulk. Acceleration was slow, particularly uphill or in soft ground. Fuel consumption was high. Mechanical reliability, while generally good, was not yet proven under extended combat conditions. The Torquematic transmission, an automatic system that was advanced for its time, had teething troubles that sometimes left tanks stranded. Most significantly, there were very few Pershings. With only 20 in all of Europe, crews knew that if their tank was damaged or destroyed, there would be no replacement. They would go back to Shermans. This knowledge made Pershing crews cautious about taking unnecessary risks, even as their improved tanks gave them greater capability. Eagle 7's first combat action came in late February 1945 during fighting along the Roer River. The engagement was brief and didn't involve enemy tanks, but it gave the crew confidence in their new vehicle. The armor shrugged off small arms fire and shell fragments. The crew began to develop tactics specific to the Pershing's capabilities and limitations. But the real test would come in early March, when the 3rd Armored Division was assigned a crucial mission: capturing Cologne, one of Germany's largest and most important cities. The ancient city straddled the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural barrier before the industrial heartland. Capturing Cologne would give the Allies a foothold on the Rhine and open the way for deeper penetration into Germany. To understand why the Pershing's appearance at Cologne was so significant, we need to understand what it was fighting against. The Panther tank, officially designated Panzerkampfwagen V Panther, was arguably the best all-around tank Germany produced during World War II. Introduced in 1943 in response to the Soviet T-34, the Panther combined excellent firepower, good armor protection, and reasonable mobility in a package that outmatched most Allied tanks. The Panther's main armament was the 75mm KWK 42L/70 gun, one of the finest tank guns of the war. The L/70 designation meant the barrel was 70 calibers long, giving the gun exceptional muzzle velocity and armor penetration. The Panther's gun could penetrate over 6 inches of armor at 1,000 yards, more than enough to defeat any Allied tank. The high velocity made it accurate at long range, and the powerful rounds retained energy well even at distance. The armor protection was excellent, particularly on the frontal arc. The front hull was sloped at 55 degrees and measured 3.1 inches thick, giving it an effective thickness of nearly 5.5 inches. The front turret was nearly 4.5 inches thick. At typical combat ranges, this made the Panther's frontal armor essentially immune to the Sherman's 75mm gun. Even the improved 76mm struggled to penetrate Panther frontal armor, except at close range. The Panther's weaknesses were its side armor, which at just 1.6 inches was vulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons, and its mechanical reliability. The Panther was a complex machine, and German industry in 1944-45 struggled to maintain quality control. Transmissions failed. Final drives broke. Engine fires were common. But a properly maintained Panther in the hands of a skilled crew was a formidable opponent that could dominate the battlefield. By March 1945, Germany had produced over 6,000 Panthers, making it the 3rd most produced German armored vehicle of the war after the Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun and the Panzer IV. Panthers equipped panzer divisions throughout the German military, forming the backbone of Germany's armored forces. Any major battle in 1944-45 was likely to involve Panthers, and Allied tankers had learned to respect and fear them. The Panther that Eagle 7 would face in Cologne was commanded by Oberleutnant Wilhelm Bartelborth, an experienced officer who had survived years of combat. Bartelborth's Panther was positioned near Cologne Cathedral, one of the few major structures still standing in the bombed-out city. The cathedral, with its distinctive twin spires, served as a landmark that helped both attackers and defenders navigate the rubble-choked streets. Bartelborth had chosen his position well. His Panther was oriented to cover a street approach, with good fields of fire and cover from surrounding rubble. He could engage American tanks as they advanced while remaining relatively protected. It was a classic ambush position, and Bartelborth knew how to exploit it. When 2 M4 Shermans came up the street, Bartelborth's gunner destroyed both with textbook gunnery. The Panther's gun spoke twice, and 2 Shermans burned. But Bartelborth didn't know that a Pershing was approaching from another direction. He didn't know such a tank existed. When his lookouts reported an American tank moving into position to engage him, Bartelborth assumed it was another Sherman. He had killed Shermans before. This would be no different. He ordered his gunner to rotate the turret to face the new threat. Operation Lumberjack, the Allied offensive designed to reach the Rhine River, kicked off on March 1, 1945. The 1st U.S. Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, advanced from multiple directions toward the river. The 3rd Armored Division would strike Cologne from the northwest, while the 9th Armored Division approached from the south, and the 104th Infantry Division advanced from the west. The goal was to surround and capture Cologne, securing the western bank of the Rhine before pushing across. Cologne was a major prize. Before the war, it had been Germany's 4th largest city, home to over 800,000 people. It was a crucial industrial center, producing everything from chemicals to rail equipment. More importantly, it was a major transportation hub, with rail lines and roads radiating out in all directions. Capturing Cologne would disrupt German logistics and deny them a key node in their defensive network. But by March 1945, Cologne was a shadow of its former self. British Bomber Command and the U.S. Army Air Forces had subjected the city to 262 separate air raids during the war. Over 34,000 tons of bombs had fallen on Cologne, destroying roughly 80% of the city. By some estimates, fewer than 20,000 civilians remained in a city that had once held hundreds of thousands. The streets were choked with rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to dust. Only a handful of major buildings remained standing, including the massive Gothic cathedral that dominated the city center. On March 3rd, Allied aircraft dropped leaflets over Cologne, telling remaining civilians not to evacuate. The leaflets promised that civilians who remained in their homes had nothing to fear from American troops. This was standard practice, designed to prevent civilian casualties and reduce the number of refugees clogging the roads. But many Cologne residents ignored the leaflets and fled eastward across the Rhine, fearing what would happen when the Americans arrived. The American assault began on March 5th. The 3rd Armored Division struck from the northwest, its tanks and infantry pushing through outer defensive positions. German resistance was initially strong but quickly collapsed under overwhelming firepower and numbers. By March 6th, American forces had penetrated to the city center, fighting from building to building, street to street, in the ruins of what had been one of Germany's great cities. The 3rd Armored Division's combat command included Company E of the 32nd Armored Regiment, Smoyer's unit. Because Eagle 7 was one of the precious Pershing tanks, it was designated to lead the advance into particularly dangerous areas. The logic was straightforward. The Pershing was better protected and more capable than the Shermans, so it should take point and deal with any German armor encountered. The Shermans would follow, providing support and dealing with softer targets. This meant that Eagle 7 and the other Pershings were constantly at the tip of the spear, pushing into unknown territory, taking the first fire from German defenders. It was dangerous work, but the crews understood the reasoning. They had the best equipment. They were expected to use it where it was needed most. The fighting in Cologne was brutal. German defenders, including Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth, and regular Wehrmacht soldiers, fought from the rubble. Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons struck from windows and doorways. Snipers picked off infantrymen. Machine guns swept streets, making movement deadly. American tanks advanced cautiously, firing at anything that might conceal an enemy. The infantry followed closely, clearing buildings and watching for threats the tankers couldn't see. Smoyer later described the experience of fighting in Cologne as terrifying and surreal. The city was a landscape of destruction unlike anything the Americans had seen. Buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks. Streets blocked by collapsed facades. The smell of smoke and death hanging over everything. And through it all, the cathedral standing untouched, its twin spires reaching toward the sky like a miracle of survival. Lieutenant William Stillman, Company E's executive officer, gave the tankers their orders with characteristic bluntness. "Gentlemen, I give you Cologne. Let's knock the hell out of it." The tankers obliged. Eagle 7 pushed into the city with Sherman's following. Infantry moved cautiously through the ruins. Combat engineers worked to clear obstacles and mark safe routes. It was methodical, grinding work, the kind of fighting where you measured progress in yards and casualties mounted steadily. On the morning of March 6th, Eagle 7 was operating in the area near Cologne Cathedral when they heard urgent radio traffic. 2 Shermans from Company E had been hit. One was destroyed, with multiple crew casualties. The other was disabled, its crew escaping before the German tank could finish it off. The radio chatter made clear that a German tank was operating in the area, positioned somewhere near the cathedral. ambushing American armor as it advanced. Early, commanding Eagle 7, made a quick decision. They would hunt the German tank. It was exactly the kind of mission the Pershing had been designed for. Tank versus tank combat against German heavy armor. Early didn't know whether they were facing a Panther, a Tiger, or something else, but it didn't matter. Eagle 7 had the gun to deal with any of them. The Sherman that had been destroyed was commanded by Lieutenant Karl Kellner, a Wisconsin native who had been commissioned on the battlefield just 2 weeks earlier. Kellner was a popular officer, respected by his men and known for his courage. When the Panther's shell penetrated his Sherman's turret, it detonated the ammunition stored inside. The explosion killed 3 of the 5 crew members instantly. Kellner, horrifically wounded with one leg blown off, managed to escape the burning tank. He collapsed near the destroyed Sherman, his severed limbs smoking in the cold March air. Stars and Stripes correspondent Andy Rooney, the future 60 Minutes journalist, was in Cologne that day covering the battle. Rooney and another soldier ran to Kellner's aid, pulling him away from the burning tank and trying to stop the bleeding. But Kellner's wounds were too severe. Rooney held the dying lieutenant in his arms, watching helplessly as Kellner bled out. It was, Rooney would later say, the first time he had witnessed death up close, an experience that haunted him for the rest of his life. The other crew members were dead in the tank, trapped by the wreckage and consumed by the fire. This was the situation when Eagle 7 received orders to engage the German tank. Somewhere near the cathedral, a Panther or Tiger was waiting in ambush. It had already killed American tankers. It would kill more if it wasn't stopped. Early and his crew knew the odds. German tanks in ambush positions had every advantage. But someone had to take them on, and Eagle 7 had the best chance of any American tank in Cologne. Early made a gutsy decision. He would dismount and scout the enemy position on foot. This was incredibly dangerous. German snipers were active in the area. The Panther's machine guns could sweep the streets. But Early needed to see where the enemy tank was positioned and plan his approach. He climbed out of Eagle 7 and moved through the rubble toward the cathedral, using cover and moving carefully until he spotted the Panther. The German tank was positioned facing a street, waiting for more American tanks to advance into its kill zone. From Early's position, he could see the Panther's side, the vulnerable armor that even a Sherman could penetrate. Better yet, Eagle 7 could approach from a parallel street and engage the Panther from the flank. Bartelborth's crew would never see them coming until it was too late. Early returned to Eagle 7 and briefed the crew. The plan was simple. McVeigh would drive Eagle 7 forward just far enough to enter the intersection where the Panther was positioned. As soon as they had line of sight, Smoyer would fire into the Panther's side. Then McVeigh would immediately back up, getting Eagle 7 out of the line of fire before the Germans could respond. It was a classic shoot-and-scoot tactic, minimizing Eagle 7's exposure while maximizing the chance of a kill. But the plan fell apart immediately. McVeigh, nervous about the engagement and perhaps misunderstanding Early's instructions, accelerated too hard. Instead of easing Eagle 7 slowly into the intersection, he drove forward aggressively, taking the tank completely into the open. Suddenly, Eagle 7 was fully exposed, sitting in the middle of the intersection with the Panther, just 100 yards away to the right. Bartelborth's crew saw Eagle 7 the moment it appeared. The Panther's turret began rotating toward this new threat. Inside Eagle 7, Early was shouting at McVeigh to back up while simultaneously ordering Smoyer to fire. But Smoyer was ahead of him. The moment the Panther appeared in his gun's sight, Smoyer had begun his engagement sequence. Later, Smoyer would describe these next moments in almost mechanical terms, as if his training had taken over and his conscious mind had stepped aside. He saw the Panther. He put the reticle on its side. He squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun roared. The recoil rocked Eagle 7. Through the scope, Smoyer saw his round strike the Panther just behind the turret ring, punching through the side armor and into the engine compartment. AP, Smoyer shouted to DeRiggy, calling for another armor-piercing round. DeRiggy, working with practiced speed, grabbed another 24-pound round from the ready rack, rammed it into the breech, and slammed the breech closed. The entire loading sequence took perhaps 3 seconds. Smoyer didn't wait for Early's order. He fired again. This round struck the Panther's turret, penetrating and detonating inside the fighting compartment. Still, the German tank did not fire back. Its gun barrel was rotating toward Eagle 7, but the turret traverse seemed agonizingly slow. Inside the Panther, confusion reigned. Bartleborth and his crew were trying to understand what they were facing. The tank in front of them didn't look like a Sherman. The hull shape was wrong. The turret was different. For a few crucial seconds, they hesitated, trying to identify the threat. Those seconds were fatal. Smoyer fired his third round. This one struck the Panther's frontal hull armor at an angle, glancing off, but creating massive spalling inside the tank. Hot metal fragments ricocheted through the interior, wounding crew members and igniting ammunition. Black smoke began pouring from the Panther's hatches as the crew scrambled to escape. The entire engagement had lasted 45 seconds. 3 shots, 3 hits. The Panther was burning, its crew bailing out and running for cover in the surrounding rubble. And the whole thing had been captured on film by Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, who had positioned himself nearby to record what he expected would be a Sherman engaging the Panther. Bates's film would become one of the most famous pieces of combat footage from World War II. Shown in movie theaters across America as part of newsreels, it would give millions of civilians a rare glimpse of tank combat. The footage shows Eagle 7 entering the intersection, the Panther visible beyond it, and the 3 shots in rapid succession. Smoke obscures the scene as the Panther burns. German crew members scramble from the hatches, their forms indistinct in the smoke and dust. One figure rolls on the ground, his clothes apparently on fire, before running for cover. For Smoyer's family back in Pennsylvania, the film was something more personal. His brother, watching the newsreel in a theater in Bethlehem, recognized Eagle 7 as Clarence's tank. After months of worrying, not knowing if Clarence was alive or dead, the family had proof that he had survived at least until early March. The relief was overwhelming. Mrs. Smoyer wept watching the film, seeing evidence that her son was still alive. The German crew survived, though some were wounded. Bartleborth and his men escaped into the ruins of Cologne, eventually making their way to German lines. After the war, Bartleborth would be interviewed about the engagement. His explanation for why he didn't fire was simple. He and his crew didn't recognize the American tank. They thought it might be a German tank that had gotten out of position. By the time they realized it was American, it was too late. This confusion was exactly what American intelligence had hoped for. The Pershing's unfamiliar silhouette, combined with German expectations that they would face only Shermans, created a moment of hesitation that proved fatal. In tank combat, hesitation means death. Bartleborth's crew learned this lesson the hard way. Eagle 7 backed out of the intersection, checking for damage. Remarkably, the Panther had not managed to fire a single shot. The tank that had destroyed 2 Shermans minutes earlier had been knocked out without scoring a hit on its killer. Early checked in with his crew. Everyone was okay, though shaken by how quickly the situation had developed. McVeigh apologized for accelerating too hard, but Early waved it off. They had accomplished the mission. The Panther was destroyed. That was what mattered. The engagement at Cologne Cathedral became the defining moment of the Pershing's combat debut in Europe. It demonstrated everything the tank had been designed to do. Kill German heavy armor in situations where Shermans were outmatched. The 90mm gun had proven its worth. The armor had provided protection, and the crew had performed brilliantly under pressure. But beyond the tactical success, the Cologne duel had psychological impact. American tankers, who had spent months fighting with inadequate equipment against superior German armor, finally had a tank that could compete on equal terms. German tankers, who had grown accustomed to dominating American armor, now had to worry about an unknown threat that could kill Panthers. The balance of armored warfare had shifted, if only slightly. The Cologne footage was shown in theaters across America in March 1945. Audiences watched as the Pershing methodically destroyed the Panther. They saw American tankers doing to German tanks what German tankers had been doing to Americans for years. The psychological impact on the home front was significant. After years of war weariness and mounting casualties, here was proof that American technology and American soldiers could match the best Germany had to offer. Smoyer himself never sought publicity for his role in the engagement. He was a modest, unassuming man who saw himself as just one soldier among millions doing a job that needed doing. When journalists tried to interview him, he deflected credit to his crew and to the tank itself. Early was equally modest, crediting Smoyer's gunnery and the Pershing's superior firepower for the victory. The technical comparison between the Pershing and the Panther reveals why the Cologne engagement turned out the way it did. On paper, the two tanks were remarkably well matched, with each having distinct advantages and disadvantages. In terms of firepower, the Panther's 75mm KWK 42L/70 gun had slightly better armor penetration than the Pershing's 90mm M3 gun at long range. The German gun's higher velocity gave it flatter trajectory and better accuracy at distance. But the Pershing's larger caliber gun fired a heavier shell that created more devastating effects on target. When both guns could penetrate enemy armor, the Pershing's 90mm created larger holes, more spalling, and more catastrophic internal damage. At the range where Smoyer engaged Bartelborth's Panther, roughly 100 yards, both guns could easily penetrate each other's side armor. The Panther's 1.6 inches of side armor could be defeated by the Pershing's armor-piercing round with ease. Similarly, the Pershing's 2.5 inches of side turret armor would not have stopped the Panther's gun at such close range. This made the engagement a matter of who fired first and who shot accurately, not a question of whether either gun could hurt the other tank. The Panther's frontal armor was superior to the Pershing's, with an effective thickness of around 5.5 inches thanks to the steep slope, compared to the Pershing's roughly 4.5 inches of effective frontal armor. In a head-on engagement at medium range, the Panther had an advantage. Its frontal armor could potentially resist the Pershing's 90mm gun, while the Panther's gun would likely penetrate the Pershing's frontal armor. This meant that in an idealized duel fought at 500 to 1,000 yards, muzzle to muzzle, the Panther had better odds. But tank combat rarely happens under idealized conditions. Engagements often occur at angles where side or rear armor is exposed. They happen in close terrain where maneuver is restricted. They involve surprise, confusion, and split-second decisions. The Cologne engagement was typical of real combat. A meeting encounter at close range where tactical decisions and crew performance mattered more than theoretical armor values. Mobility was one area where the Panther had clear superiority. The Maybach HL230P30 engine produced 700 horsepower, giving the 45-ton Panther a much better power-to-weight ratio than the Pershing. The Panther could reach 28 miles per hour cross-country, compared to the Pershing's 20. The Panther was also more nimble, with better acceleration and more responsive handling. In situations requiring quick movement or tactical repositioning, the Panther had the edge. This mobility advantage was partly offset by the Panther's mechanical unreliability. The Maybach engine was prone to overheating. The transmission and final drives were weak points that frequently failed. Panthers often broke down during road marches, victims of mechanical problems rather than enemy action. The Pershing, by contrast, used proven American automotive technology that was generally reliable, if underpowered. A Pershing might be slow, but it was less likely to break down than a Panther. Crew ergonomics and working conditions favored the Pershing. American tank designers prioritized crew comfort and efficiency, understanding that tired, uncomfortable crews performed poorly in combat. The Pershing had spacious crew stations, good ventilation, and thoughtfully arranged controls and instruments. The gun controls were smooth and responsive. The loader had room to work without constantly bumping into other crew members. The commander had excellent visibility through multiple periscopes. The Panther, by contrast, reflected German design priorities that emphasized performance over crew comfort. The fighting compartment was cramped. The loader had to work in awkward positions. The commander's visibility was adequate, but not exceptional. The gun controls required more physical effort to operate. Over long missions, these differences in ergonomics accumulated into crew fatigue that degraded performance. One often overlooked advantage the Pershing had was ammunition stowage. The Pershing carried 70 rounds of 90mm ammunition, stored in armored bins with blowout panels. If the ammunition was hit, the blowout panels would direct the explosion outside the tank, potentially allowing the crew to survive. The Panther carried only 82 rounds of 75mm ammunition, and the stowage was less sophisticated. When a Panther's ammunition was hit, The explosion often destroyed the entire tank and killed the crew, as happened to WWII's Panther. The Pershing also had better fire suppression systems and generally better crew safety features. American tanks included fire extinguishers, improved escape hatches, and safety measures designed to protect crews. German tanks, particularly late-war Panthers produced under increasingly desperate conditions, often lacked these features. This meant that Pershing crews had better chances of surviving hits and escaping damaged tanks than their German counterparts. In terms of production quality, this was a significant factor by March 1945. Early Pershings, produced in late 1944 and early 1945 at the Grand Blanc Arsenal in Michigan, were built to high standards with proper quality control. Late-war Panthers, produced in factories subjected to Allied bombing and suffering from shortages of materials and skilled labor, often had quality issues. Hulls might be poor, armor might be improperly heat-treated, components might be made from substitute materials that were less durable than specified. The psychological factor of facing an unknown opponent cannot be measured but was clearly significant. German tankers in 1945 had spent years fighting Shermans. They knew Sherman capabilities intimately. They knew where to shoot Shermans for quick kills. They knew how Shermans moved and fought. The Pershing was an unknown quantity. German tankers didn't know its capabilities, its armor layout, its gun performance. This uncertainty created hesitation and confusion, as demonstrated at Cologne. Conversely, American Pershing crews knew they had a tank that could finally compete with German armor on relatively equal terms. This confidence translated into more aggressive tactics, greater willingness to engage, and better crew performance. Tankers who had spent months feeling outgunned and vulnerable now had a psychological edge that came from knowing they had competitive equipment. The Cologne engagement proved that the Pershing could do what it was designed to do: kill German heavy tanks in combat. But it was just one battle in a much larger war. What happened to Eagle 7 and the other Pershings in the remaining weeks of World War II would determine whether the tank's promise could be consistently delivered across multiple engagements. After Cologne, Eagle 7 continued fighting through Germany. The 3rd Armored Division pushed eastward, encountering scattered German resistance as the Reich collapsed. Smoyer and his crew engaged additional targets, though none as dramatic as the Cologne duel. They destroyed German defensive positions, supported infantry attacks, and participated in the final Allied push into the German heartland. Other Pershings saw action in various sectors. Some performed well, confirming the design's effectiveness. Others experienced mechanical problems that sidelined them. The small number of Pershings meant that each tank's actions were closely monitored and reported up the chain of command. Army evaluators were trying to determine whether the Pershing should be standardized as the primary American heavy tank or whether further development was needed. One significant Pershing action occurred near Dessau in April 1945. A Pershing commanded by Sergeant Nicholas Maschlonik encountered a German Jag Panther tank destroyer, one of the most formidable German armored vehicles. The Jag Panther mounted an 88mm gun in a heavily armored, low-profile casemate. Its frontal armor exceeded 6 inches in some areas, making it nearly impervious to most Allied guns. Maschlonik's Pershing engaged the Jag Panther at medium range. The first shot glanced off the German vehicle's sloped frontal armor without penetrating. Maschlonik's gunner adjusted and fired again, this time striking the Jag Panther's side as it attempted to maneuver. The 90mm round penetrated, destroying the German vehicle. The engagement demonstrated that while the Pershing's gun was powerful, even it struggled against the heaviest German armor when striking at oblique angles. Another notable engagement occurred when a Pershing from the 9th Armored Division encountered a King Tiger heavy tank, Germany's heaviest production tank. The King Tiger, with nearly 7 inches of frontal armor and an 88mm gun, was a formidable opponent that could destroy any Allied tank at extreme range. The Pershing engaged at approximately 800 yards, firing multiple rounds at the King Tiger's frontal armor. Most rounds failed to penetrate, but one struck the King Tiger's gun mantlet at a fortunate angle, penetrating into the turret and disabling the German tank. The crew escaped, but the King Tiger was knocked out of action. These engagements revealed both the Pershing's capabilities and its limitations. Against Panther tanks and most other German armor, the Pershing was highly effective. Against the heaviest German tanks like the King Tiger or Jag Tiger, the Pershing struggled, though it still had better chances than a Sherman. The 90mm gun was powerful but not overwhelming against Germany's best armor. Mechanical reliability proved mixed. Some Pershings performed flawlessly through weeks of combat. Others experienced transmission problems, engine issues, or track failures. The 4GAF engine's marginal power-to-weight ratio meant that crews had to be careful about crossing soft ground or climbing steep slopes. Several Pershings became stuck in mud or ditched attempting to traverse difficult terrain. The automatic transmission, while advanced, required careful maintenance and occasionally failed under combat stresses. Crews learned to baby their transmissions, avoiding sudden starts or aggressive maneuvers that might stress the system. When transmissions did fail, replacement parts were scarce, sometimes leaving Pershings stranded for days while repair crews worked to fix them. Fuel consumption was a constant concern. The Pershing's thirsty engine consumed fuel at a rate that strained logistics. The tank carried 180 gallons of gasoline, giving it an operational range of roughly 100 miles under ideal conditions. In combat, with frequent stops, starts, and maneuvering, the range dropped to 60 or 70 miles. This meant that Pershings required more frequent refueling than Shermans, adding to the logistical burden. Despite these issues, crews who operated Pershings overwhelmingly preferred them to Shermans. The improved protection and firepower outweighed the mobility and reliability concerns. Given a choice, experienced tankers wanted Pershings. The psychological reassurance of knowing you could fight German heavy tanks on equal terms was worth the trade-offs. As April turned to May and Germany's collapse accelerated, the Pershings saw less action. German resistance was crumbling. Entire divisions surrendered en masse. The few remaining German tanks often lacked fuel or ammunition to fight effectively. The war in Europe was clearly ending, and the Pershings had arrived too late to make a strategic difference. But their tactical impact and the lessons learned were significant. The Army's evaluation of the Pershing's combat performance was generally positive. The tank had proven its basic design sound. The 90mm gun was effective. The armor provided good protection. The crew ergonomics were excellent. But the mobility issues needed to be addressed, and mechanical reliability needed improvement. These lessons would inform post-war tank development. The M26 Pershing would be standardized and enter large-scale production after the war. An improved version with a more powerful engine, the M46 Patton, would address the mobility concerns. Eventually, the American tank development path that began with the T-20 series and produced the Pershing would lead to the M47, M48, and M60 main battle tanks that would serve through the Cold War. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Eagle 7 and its crew had survived, beating the odds that killed so many tankers. Smoyer, Early, McVeigh, de Riggy, and Davis had fought from Normandy to the heart of Germany, and they were all still alive. For tankers, who faced casualty rates that sometimes exceeded 50% in intensive combat, this was remarkable fortune. The end of the war brought immediate changes. The urgency of combat was replaced by occupation duties. Tanks that had been vital combat assets became equipment to be maintained and eventually shipped home or scrapped. Eagle 7, which had achieved fame at Cologne, became just another tank in the inventory, its combat days over. Smoyer and his crew were eventually demobilized and sent home. They returned to civilian life, trying to readjust to a world without war. For many veterans, this transition was difficult. The intensity of combat, the bonds formed with crew members, the sense of purpose that came from a clear mission, all of this was gone. Civilian life seemed pale and purposeless by comparison. Smoyer returned to Pennsylvania, eventually settling in Allentown. He married, raised a family, and worked in construction. He rarely talked about the war. Like many combat veterans, he found that civilians couldn't understand what he had experienced, and he saw no point in trying to explain. The Cologne engagement, which had made headlines in 1945, became just a memory that he rarely discussed. Robert Early returned to Minnesota, where he too settled into civilian life. The crew members scattered across the country, staying in touch sporadically but eventually losing contact as the years passed. The tight bonds formed in combat loosened in peacetime. Life moved on. The Pershing, meanwhile, continued its military career. Pershings were sent to Korea in 1950 when war broke out on the peninsula. There they faced North Korean T-34-85 tanks, Soviet-designed medium tanks that had dominated the early weeks of the war. The Pershing's 90mm gun proved highly effective against the T-34, and American Pershing crews racked up impressive kill ratios. One particularly notable engagement occurred in August 1950 at the Battle of the Bowling Alley, where American Pershings destroyed several T-34s in night fighting. The Pershing's superior gun stabilization and crew optics gave American tankers an advantage in low-light conditions. Throughout the Korean War, Pershings served effectively, though they were gradually replaced by the improved M26 Patton as it became available. The Korean experience validated the Pershing's design and demonstrated that American heavy tanks could compete effectively against Soviet armor. The lessons learned in the final months of World War II and in Korea would inform American tank doctrine for decades. The emphasis on firepower, armor protection, and crew survivability that the Pershing embodied would remain central to American tank design through the M48, M60, M1 Abrams, and beyond. But for decades, the Pershing story was largely forgotten outside military circles. The tank had arrived too late to affect World War II's outcome strategically. Only 20 Pershings saw combat in Europe before V-Day. Their impact, while tactically significant, was overshadowed by the thousands of Shermans that bore the brunt of the armored warfare from Normandy to Berlin. The Cologne engagement remained famous among tank enthusiasts and military historians, but the general public moved on to other stories. The dramatic footage of Eagle 7 destroying the Panther was shown occasionally in documentaries, but without context or follow-up. The identities of the crew members were often confused or incorrect. Smoyer himself faded into obscurity, just one veteran among millions. This began to change in 2015 when author Adam Makos published Spearhead, an American tank gunner, his enemy, and a collision of lives in World War II. The book told the story of Smoyer and the Cologne engagement in detail, bringing the story to a new generation. Makos interviewed Smoyer extensively, capturing his memories before they were lost. More importantly, Makos tracked down Gustav Schaefer, one of the German tank crew members from Bartelborth's Panther. Schaefer had survived the war and was living in Germany. Through Makos's efforts, Smoyer and Schaefer met in 2013, nearly 70 years after their brief, violent encounter at Cologne Cathedral. The meeting was emotional for both men, two old veterans who had tried to kill each other as young soldiers, but who now shared the bond of having survived a terrible war. Schaefer explained what had happened inside the Panther during those crucial seconds. The crew had been confused by Eagle 7's appearance. They didn't recognize the tank. Some thought it might be German. By the time they realized it was American, Smoyer had already fired his first shot. They were trying to rotate the turret to engage when the second shot hit. The third shot convinced them the tank was doomed, and they bailed out before the ammunition exploded. This explanation confirmed what historians had suspected. The Pershing's unfamiliarity had created fatal hesitation. In tank combat, seconds matter. The few seconds that Bartelborth's crew spent trying to identify Eagle 7 were enough time for Smoyer to kill them. The Pershing's secret weapon wasn't just its gun or armor. It was the psychological impact of its novelty. The publicity around Makos's book brought renewed attention to Smoyer's service and the Cologne engagement. Veterans organizations recognized that Smoyer and his crew had never received appropriate recognition for their actions. The original after-action reports had been lost or misfiled. No medals had been awarded at the time, despite the significance of the engagement. In 2019, at age 95, Clarence Smoyer finally received official recognition. At a ceremony attended by family, fellow veterans, and military officials, Smoyer was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions at Cologne. It was 74 years late, but the recognition meant something to Smoyer and to his family. The ceremony acknowledged not just Smoyer's gunnery, but the service of all the tankers who had fought in outmatched Shermans before the Pershing arrived. Bob Early had died in 2014, before the recognition came. He never received official acknowledgement for his leadership during the Cologne engagement, though his family took comfort in knowing his role was finally being documented and appreciated. The other crew members, McVeigh, DeRiggy, and Davis, had also passed away by the time of the 2019 ceremony. Smoyer was the last survivor of Eagle 7's crew. The story of the Pershing and the Cologne duel resonates because it represents several themes that run through World War II history. First, it demonstrates the importance of technological competition in modern warfare. The Allies' ability to develop and deploy the Pershing, even late in the war, showed that American industry and engineering could match German capabilities when properly motivated. Second, it illustrates the human cost of doctrinal rigidity. The Army ground forces resistance to heavy tanks, based on pre-war doctrine that proved flawed in combat, cost American lives. Tankers fought for years in inadequate Shermans because institutional inertia prevented the deployment of better equipment. Only the catastrophic losses at the Battle of the Bulge finally broke through this resistance. Third, the story highlights the courage of individual soldiers who fought with whatever equipment they were given. Sherman crews knew they were outmatched. They knew that German tanks could kill them from ranges where they couldn't effectively fight back. They fought anyway, using tactics, teamwork, and sheer determination to overcome equipment disadvantages. The arrival of the Pershing didn't make them braver, it just gave them a fighting chance. Fourth, the Cologne engagement demonstrates how battles are decided by the intersection of technology, tactics, training, and individual skill. Eagle 7's victory wasn't predetermined by having a Pershing. It resulted from Smoyer's exceptional gunnery, Early's tactical decision-making, the crew's training and cohesion, and the advantage of surprise. A different crew, or different circumstances, might have produced a different outcome. Finally, the story illustrates how individual moments in war can achieve significance beyond their immediate tactical impact. The Cologne duel didn't change the war's course. Germany was going to lose regardless of whether one Panther was destroyed. But the engagement mattered to the tankers who witnessed it, to the families who saw Smoyer's tank in newsreels, and to the historical record that shows what American soldiers and American industry could accomplish when properly equipped and trained. There's a tragic footnote to the Cologne story that was only discovered decades later. Katharina Esser was a young German woman who lived near Cologne Cathedral. On the morning of March 6, 1945, she was in her apartment when the fighting began. The building was struck by shells during the engagement, possibly from the Panther's shots that destroyed the two Shermans, possibly from American return fire. Katharina was killed by the blast, one of countless civilian casualties of urban warfare. For years, her death was unrecorded in official histories, just another victim of the battle for Cologne. But local German historians, researching the battle, discovered her story and connected it to the famous tank Duel captured on film. Katharina died at 28, killed by a battle she had no part in, fighting she couldn't influence, in a war her country had started but she hadn't chosen. Her story reminds us that the famous engagements we study, the tactical victories we celebrate, took place amid human tragedy on a scale difficult to comprehend. The ruins of Cologne where Eagle 7 fought had once been neighborhoods where people lived, worked, loved, and raised families. The destruction was total. The human cost was staggering. War is not just dueling tanks and tactical maneuvers. It's Katharina Esser dying in her apartment, an anonymous victim of forces beyond her control. The legacy of the M26 Pershing extends far beyond its limited combat service in World War II. The tank represented a philosophical shift in American armor doctrine, from the idea that tanks should avoid other tanks to the recognition that tanks must be able to fight enemy armor on equal terms. This shift would inform all subsequent American tank development. The 90mm gun became the standard armament for American tanks in the immediate post-war period. The M46 patent, M47 patent, and even early M48 patents all mounted 90mm guns. The basic design principles established with the Pershing, well-sloped armor, powerful gun, spacious crew compartment, reliable automotive systems, would carry forward through decades of American tank development. More broadly, the Pershing's development and deployment demonstrated that American industry could rapidly design, produce, and field sophisticated military equipment when properly motivated. The fact that the Pershing went from concept to combat in less than 3 years, despite institutional resistance, showed the dynamism of American military-industrial capabilities. This lesson would prove valuable during the Cold War, when rapid technological development became crucial to maintaining military superiority. The Cologne engagement specifically became a case study in tank tactics, crew training, and the importance of technological surprise. Military schools taught the engagement to generations of armor officers, using it to illustrate principles of maneuver warfare, crew coordination, and decision-making under fire. The footage shot by Jim Bates became perhaps the most watched piece of actual tank-versus-tank combat ever filmed, shown countless times in documentaries and educational materials. Today, an M26 Pershing is displayed at the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia. It sits among the tanks that preceded and followed it, a physical reminder of a crucial period in armored warfare development. Visitors can see the 90mm gun, the sloped armor, the spacious turret that made the Pershing such an improvement over the Sherman. They can imagine 5 young men operating this machine in combat, their lives dependent on its steel and their skills. Eagle 7 itself no longer exists. Like most Pershings that survived the war, it was eventually scrapped as newer tanks made it obsolete. No effort was made to preserve the specific tank that fought at Cologne, though in retrospect it would have been fitting to save this particular vehicle. The tank that destroyed a Panther in one of the war's most famous engagements deserved better than the scrapyard. But the story survives. The footage survives. And most importantly, for a time, Clarence Smoyer survived to tell his story. He lived to 95, long enough to see his actions recognized and appreciated, long enough to meet his former enemy and shake his hand, long enough to know that what he and his crew did mattered, that they were part of something larger than themselves. Smoyer died in 2022, the last crew member of Eagle 7 to pass away. With his death, the direct human connection to that March morning in Cologne was lost. No one remains who can describe what it felt like to peer through the gun sight at a Panther tank, to squeeze the trigger knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether you lived or died. The experience of that moment exists now only in recorded memories and historical records. But the lessons remain. The importance of technological superiority in modern warfare. The courage of soldiers who fight with inadequate equipment while their nations catch up. The value of training and crew cohesion. The decisive nature of individual moments in combat. These lessons, learned at Cologne and 1,000 other engagements across World War II, continue to inform how modern militaries think about armored warfare. The secret tank that Germans couldn't recognize turned out to be the future of American armored warfare. The Pershing arrived too late to change World War II's outcome, but it arrived in time to prove that American industry and American soldiers could match the best the Germans had to offer. In 45 seconds at Cologne Cathedral, Eagle 7 demonstrated what American tanks would become: powerful, well-protected, and in the hands of skilled crews, deadly. The German Panther commander who hesitated, trying to identify the unfamiliar American tank, paid for that hesitation with his life and the lives of his crew. It was a lesson learned too late for Germany, but learned in time for American armor doctrine to change. The tanks that followed the Pershing, the Pattons, the M60, the M1 Abrams, would never be undergunned or underarmored relative to their opponents. The Sherman's inadequacies had taught a painful lesson. The Pershing showed that lesson had been learned. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the story of the M26 Pershing and the famous Cologne tank duel, please like this video and subscribe to WWII Tales. There are countless more stories from World War II waiting to be told, from individual acts of courage to technological innovations to the grand strategic decisions that shaped the war's outcome. Each story adds to our understanding of what the war meant and what we can learn from it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.